On today's World Insight, Iran on National Army Day shows it's no pushover. But what could ease tensions with the U.S.? And incentives for China and the U.S. to pursue trade negotiations. What does it take?
This is an opportunity for them to showcase they have that leadership.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show in Iran. The country has marked National Army Day by holding a parade showcasing its military achievements. In the capital, Tehran, Iranian Army units paraded the country's advanced weaponry. President Hassan Rouhani, along with top military commanders and the Islamic Revolution Guard, attended the Thursday ceremony. Rouhani delivered a speech calling on the Middle East states to unite and what he called drive back Zionism.
If we have a problem in the region today, the roots of these problems are either from Zionism or America's arrogance. The region's nations have lived alongside each other for centuries and never had a problem. Let us stand together, be together, and rid the region of aggressors' presence. Let us drive back the Zionism that has been busy committing crimes in the region for 70 years and restore the historic right of the nation of Palestine through each other's help and brotherhood.
For the Iranian Army Day and Iran's regional agenda, we are joined in Tehran by Mohammad Marandi, who is a professor at Tehran University. Professor, welcome to our program. Joining us from Washington in the United States, Michael O'Halloran, a senior fellow with the Center for 21st Century Securities and Intelligence, also Director of Research for the Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Welcome as well. Meanwhile, in our Beijing studio, Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies of the China Institute of International Studies. I want to start with you, Professor Marandi, of course. What exactly does Mr. Rouhani mean when he's talking about Zionism?
Well, one of the problems that the Iranians feel is key in this region is that the United States devises its policy based upon the needs of the Israeli regime, and therefore undermining, whether it's undermining Syria or weakening, keeping Jordan weak, or undermining the elected government in Egypt. The United States, its interests, I think the belief here is that its interests come secondary to the interests of the Israeli regime. And from the Iranian perspective, the Israeli regime is an apartheid regime. It's an expansionist regime, like apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and 80s. And now we see that it is annexing the territory of Syria, the territory of the Palestinians based upon UN resolutions. And so the Iranians feel that a lot of their problems, really the root of that problem, is because of the U.S.-Israeli relationship.
I see. Mr. O'Halloran, of course, it's no secret that Israel are not necessarily in good terms with Iran. However, Mr. O'Halloran, recently there have been one after another actions by the Trump administration toward Iran. Probably that also addressed the root cause why Mr. Rouhani is becoming very hostile, at least in words, toward the United States. Mr. O'Halloran.
Well, yes, that may explain some of the recent decision. However, if we look at conflict throughout the broader Middle East today, it has almost nothing to do with Israel and very little to do even with the American presence. It's fundamentally Sunni Shia violence, which Iran stokes and participates in Iraq and in Yemen and in Syria. And it's also internal struggles within regimes, within countries like Egypt. And sometimes the United States makes bad decisions. I think we have not done well, for example, in regard to Syria. But it was not because we were doing Israel's beck and call. In fact, Israel would have been better off if there had never been a revolution against Assad in the first place. So the status quo from before 2011 was better for Israel. And we, the United States, we did not support that status quo. We supported the protesters and then the insurgents in Syria. And I think we did a very bad job. but it had almost nothing to do with Zionism. It had very little to do with our desire for a broader presence in the Middle East. We were trying to take the side of reform, and we handled it badly. So I just think the Iranian message is very hackneyed, very old, and sort of irrelevant.
Mr. Lee, of course, China was also part of the JCPOA. Now U.S. has already turned its back against the earlier mechanism. Now, so what is the next step if the sanctions continues in Washington against Iran? Situation in the Middle East considered to get worse than what it is today. What can we expect the regional power struggle?
I think since the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, almost come to 1 year. But I'm very glad at this moment the remaining parties of the JCPOA and made it very clearly that we will still, to implement this nuclear deal. And certainly, I think, we don't know exactly what would happen. And since, it seems the Iranians, the patience or, their commitments to the JCPOA, as some of the officials say that, have already run away. And they also prepare and also warning to, the international community that, if the other parties are not, to implement their obligations, they would also maybe, quit from the JCPOA.
Right.
So I think, this will be very, very dangerous for the region.
I see. Mr. Rouhani, of course, the sanctions against Iran, U.S. has already unilaterally put over there, but the next step, of course, early May, people talk about sanctions regarding to the oil market now in Iran and for other regional and beyond powers as well. What do you make of the very complicated picture and realities right now?
Well, what I'm hoping is that the United States will not put a lot of pressure on buyers of Iranian oil to cut purchases even further. I think we're in a position that is not altogether bad if we can essentially stay where we are until the next American presidential election, which could create new opportunities, not to go back to the original JCPOA, but perhaps to modify it to extend the limits on Iran's nuclear activity. And if Iran will do that, and if we can reach some kind of broad understanding about violence in the Middle East, without agreeing on every point, but at least agreeing not to intensify the current conflicts anymore, maybe we could see the world return to a modified JCPOA. That's the kind of vision that I hope will be possible. And I think that vision is well served by a modest amount or a minimal amount of Iranian oil exports, which are enough to keep the Iranian economy struggling but sort of afloat in essentially this holding pattern for the next 2 years or so. For me, that's the best vision that I can articulate for how we could avoid a worsening of the crisis.
But Professor Marandi, it seems that Washington had been putting out, the current administration rather, has been putting out this one gesture after another. For example, sanctions and then withdrawing from JCPOA. Now regarding Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist group, which the Iranians consider as its a military troop. So how will Tehran eventually react to this, particularly given also the internal discussion, if not debate, you have in your own country regarding what should be the nature of your country and how you should deal with the West?
Well, obviously, I think it's very clear that Iran will not accept any changes to the JCPOA. In fact, if the United States pushes much further, and if the international community abides by U.S. demands, I think the chances for Iran to ultimately exit the agreement increase. And I think that there may be steps in the not-so-distant future for Iran to gradually ignore certain parts of the agreement in order to respond to American pressure. So I think the Americans are miscalculating, and they're pushing the situation towards greater tension. So the best response to Trump's behavior is for the international community to ignore him. I would also like to respond to your guests in the United States that what we all know in this region that the Israelis, the Saudis, and the United States are very close to one another, and they are an alliance. So this is not about Shias and Sunnis. The Zaydis in Yemen are not Shias in the sense that the Iranians are, or ISIS, the vast majority of the people who were massacred by ISIS in Iraq and Syria were Sunnis, and Western intelligence agencies as well as their regional allies allowed ISIS to thrive, and today they're allowing Al-Qaeda to thrive. We know this from the WikiLeaks documents. We know from the WikiLeaks documents that Hillary Clinton said that the overthrow of Assad would be good for Israel. We know from her documents that from her emails that she knew in 2014 that Saudi Arabia and others were supporting ISIS. And we know that on Al Jazeera, the former head of the Mossad said that the Israelis have no problem with Al-Qaeda because Al-Qaeda never did anything against Israel. So, and he was justifying their support for Al-Qaeda and ISIS
today our topic is not necessarily about the Israel and what Israel has done or has not, but rather also specifically on Iran. Professor, I have to point that out, Professor, if you allow me.
In order to put pressure on President Assad. These are things that are out there for anyone to see.
Probably our guest is having a problem in Iran listening to my voice at this point. We'll test with him later to see if the voice is still there. I want to go to you, Mr. O'Halloran, that I didn't try to cut off Professor Marandi, but rather probably there's a listening issue over there. But Mr. O'Halloran, what Professor Marandi has been suggesting to us is quite interesting. That is, he's trying to say no matter what the administration, which party it belongs to, there has always been a kind of hostile framework against Iran. And therefore, what you have proposed, the so-called wait until the next election in the U.S., it's just a matter of kicking the can down the road, not necessarily going to solve the problem at all. Mr. O'Halloran.
Right, thank you. By the way, your professor in Iran raised a lot of points, and when he criticized the United States for not being very effective in Syria, I agree with that. I think just to reiterate, we have made big mistakes there. But it certainly was not because we tolerated or wished to see ISIS or Al-Qaeda or didn't have an issue with them. And of course, the United States and Saudi Arabia disagreed very badly on the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, where the Saudis did not think that was good because they didn't want to see a Sunni leader displaced and didn't want to see a Shia majority empowered. And so in that sense, Iran should not blame that one on some American Saudi axis. But to your point about Iran since 1979, I agree. I agree that the United States has been hostile towards the Iranian regime ever since that regime came into being, because that regime came into being as a revolutionary regime that wanted to export its revolution. And we have seen Iran do this, creating Hezbollah, for example, in 1980 or so in Lebanon, and in 1983 about 300 Americans were killed in bombings in Lebanon that Hezbollah conducted. So going back to that time, Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, there have been antagonisms in both directions. So it certainly is factually correct to say that U.S.-Iranian relations have been poor for 40 years.
So my question rather is about looking forward, isn't it? That's what you have also proposed. You proposed to the next administration. Well, at this point, we do not know who the next administration will go to, whether it's the Democrats or Republican or a very different dark horse as Mr. Trump was during the last round of elections. So, Mr. O'Halloran, the question really is whether the U.S. is going to think constructively toward its relationship with Iran, or will always remain hostile despite the fact of enormous efforts of JCPOA earlier made during the Obama administration for years, and the world community applauded that as a success. And now, of course, it seems things are falling apart. Very briefly from you, Mr. O'Halloran, and then I go to my Iranian guest, since earlier he did not be able to listen to me through the earpiece. Okay, Mr. O'Halloran, go ahead.
Well, briefly, I think it's going to be difficult to have a good U.S.-Iran relationship until there has been some quelling of all the unrest throughout the broader Middle East that we believe Iran is often actively stoking for its own interests, from Yemen to Syria to Iraq to Lebanon and beyond. And unless that is somehow at least mitigated, or at least we can work out some kind of modus vivendi where we agree to try to calm it down, I don't think you can isolate the nuclear issue the way the Obama administration tried. The issues are too interlinked.
Now, Professor Marandi, without reacting even more to what the American panelists had to say, I know you guys can discuss this for years and probably even more than that, but Professor Marandi, I want to ask you about this. The Iranians are having very clear message for the rest of the world that they want to have a multilateral kinds of interactions on the world stage, including its relation with the other world power besides the United States, with Russia, with China, with the Europeans. So, Professor Marandi, what do you think are likely to be the decisions that Tehran would make for the near future about how it would interact with the rest of the world, and how dangerous the West should look at Iran from what Iran's plan might be?
I think the policy in Tehran is to gradually move away from Europe because the Europeans have shown themselves to be too weak in standing up against Trump. And therefore, the focus will be on enhancing ties with countries like China, Russia, Asian countries, and regional countries. And the Iranians feel that this is a policy that is receptive to many nations, because the Iranians see that others also are concerned about the U.S. behavior, not only by the fact that the United States has helped destroy Syria through supporting extremists, or destroyed Libya, or starved Yemen, or destroyed Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, but also because the United States is taking out countries that are producing oil, undermining those countries. For example, Venezuela today, which is being, the people are being punished by the United States in a regime change project. And this makes countries like China, for example, more reliant on fewer and fewer countries. And most of those countries are client regimes of the United States. And so if the United States tells its client regimes in the Persian Gulf region or elsewhere to put pressure on China or other independent countries, those countries would do so. So it is necessary for many countries in Asia and beyond to have this diversity. So I think basically the Europeans, by abiding by U.S. demands, their interest in the region will gradually diminish. It's going to be difficult for Iran, but if the Europeans simply cannot abide by their commitments according to the nuclear deal, then the Iranians have no option but to change their foreign policy.
Mr. Lee, of course, China has been advocating to increase its economic interactions with players in the Middle East, including with countries like Iran. However, China has been advocating about not to interfere in others' internal affairs, and also want to place a strategic balance among all in the region, including relationship with Saudi Arabia and also Israel as well. So what would be, the way that China is looking at Iran choosing its direction and also in interaction with the United States? Mr. Lee, briefly.
I think firstly, we encourage, the Iranians still to maintain within the JCPOA, because that is good for everyone. And second, I think, China's policy is we encourage and urge the countries with disputes to solve their problems through dialogue, not through the violence. And we also, to, as you mentioned, that to advocate, sort of economic developments, because that is the main concern, the main needs or demands of the people. Through these economic developments can solve a lot of problems, and we work together with all the countries in the region to keep the peace, stability.
Okay. Li Guofu, Michael O'Hanlon, Mohammad Marandi, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us.